A well-constructed braided border can be an elegant waltz around the rim of your basket. Hi, this is Beverly. A braided border is a great way to add a little something extra to a plain basket, or it can be a solution for those challenging baskets with uneven or something my friend recently called a roller coaster rim. A braided border can give your basket that crowning touch it deserves. Many avoid learning to weave braided borders because they appear complicated. Written patterns describing the process can be a bit daunting, so I thought maybe a video of the process might help those weavers wanting to learn. This video is in 3 parts. Part 1 will introduce the borders and explain basket preparation. It shows tips and how to insert the weavers since both braids are prepared in the same way. Part 2 details weaving the simple double braided border, and Part 3 explains weaving the rewoven double braided border. This video may be difficult for beginning weavers since it assumes a mastery of basket weaving techniques. If you are a beginner, watching with an experienced weaver can help fill in the gaps. If you're taking a class or following a basket pattern, use the directions from the teacher or the basket designer. They generally have reasons for doing things their way. Not following the instructions could affect the final outcome of your basket. We are going to explore 2 types of braided borders, a simple double braided border and the rewoven double braided border. I'm calling it a double braided border because I have also woven a braid on the inside of the basket to finish off the rim, instead of the traditional rolled border. From this point forward, I will refer to them as a simple braid and a rewoven braid. Here are 2 identical hearth-style baskets. One is a simple braid, the other has a rewoven braid. This one is a bit smaller, and it's called a simple braid. On the right is the much larger rewoven braid. I usually reserve this one for a little bit bigger baskets and the simple braid for smaller baskets. These baskets are completed almost exactly the same with a braid on the inside. The simple braid uses a 4-step process, and the rewoven requires a 7-step method. The 7th step is a row underneath added to compensate for the larger braid. Here are some things that you might want to keep in mind. If you're new to weaving braided borders, weave a basket at least 8 inches in diameter and without a handle. The round or oval shaped basket rim is easier to work with and allows you to see what you're doing. If you use a square base, woven or wooden, I recommend that you weave it to a round or oval shape at the top. I'd recommend using number 2 round reed for smaller baskets. Larger baskets with a larger curve and more space between the spokes likely will look better with number 3. For an average size basket, I recommend having a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch space between the basket spokes at the rim. Cut your weavers anywhere from 25 inches to 45 inches long. Some patterns recommend weavers up to 60 inches long, but I found you will only need approximately 25 inches for the simple braid and 45 inches for the rewoven braid. We'll be weaving an 8-inch diameter basket for the simple braid and a 9x12 oval basket for the rewoven braid. Add length if you want. I like my weavers a little longer because they seem easier to manage toward the end of the process. I also use the cutoffs for other projects. Again, if you're following a basket pattern with braided instructions, use the designer's recommendations. Soak your weavers thoroughly. A 10 to 15 minute soak should do it. It'll be quicker if you use heated water. Make sure the weavers are wet to the core of the reed. That helps ensure they don't dry out too quickly. Put a towel inside the basket to protect the base. You'll be constantly spraying the border reed while weaving. That can saturate the base. A woven or even sealed wooden base can mildew overnight. Ask me why I know. While number 2 reed is more pliable, it also requires more water to stay flexible. It dries quicker. Whatever size you use, spray the entire length of the weavers when starting a new round. Tag your first 2 weavers on every round as you weave. You can tag them using a twist tie, a pipe cleaner, zip tie, piece of seagrass cord, wax linen, or anything which can handle being soaked with water. These tags make it easier to identify your starting point as you end a row. Inspect your weavers carefully before inserting them. As elementary as this may seem, you'll want to complete your entire border without breaking a weaver. So, check your reed. If any of it looks cracked, wimpy, frazzled, or thin, don't use it. You will be manipulating these weavers a lot, creating a great deal of stress on them. They can be a challenge to replace. Taking time up front to ensure you're using good weavers and keeping them damp while you're weaving can make all the difference. Concentrate on the position of your weavers. We are weaving in pairs, so you want to make sure that your weavers don't get twisted during the process. This is key to a smooth-looking braid. Replace a broken weaver by inserting a new one alongside the broken one. Careful reed inspection, mindful reed manipulation, and keeping them damp will help prevent breakage. But if it happens, you can replace a broken weaver. The process is a bit tedious and not perfect, but it lets you move forward. In part 3 of this video, we'll show you how to replace a broken weaver because step 4 of the rewoven braid is the most common time for them to break. Weave the border in one sitting if you can. You don't want the weavers to dry out. If you take a short break, wait until you finish the step you're currently weaving. When you return, thoroughly wet the weavers before continuing. Weaving either of these borders actually goes pretty quick, depending on your proficiency. They are much faster than weaving a Gretchen. Limit the number of distractions while you're weaving. This border takes concentration, especially the first time you weave them. It only takes looking up once to lose your place or pick up the wrong weaver. Here are some items you'll need to weave this border. Number 2 or number 3 round reed. Again, number 2 for smaller baskets, number 3 for larger. You want to use reed proportional to the rest of your basket. Towels, a large spray bottle, you'll be using a lot of water, clips of various sizes, twist ties, basket shears, tape measure, and either a fid, awl, packing tool, or lash saver. I'm often asked about a fid. It's a sailor's tool used to hold open knots or strands of rope for splicing. We use it as a channel to slide reed through your weaving and to lash rims. You are now ready to insert your weavers. As I said before, both the simple braid and the rewoven braid are started identically. I'm going to be using this 8-inch round basket for this demo, but the 9 by 12-inch basket is prepared in the same way. Weave your basket to the desired height. Then, using either number 2 or number 3 round reed, the same size you plan on using for the border, twine 3 rows around the basket. You can choose to use the same color that matches your basket or that matches the border. My preference is to use the same color as the border. This is your rim row. Cut and tuck all of the basket spokes. Yes, I said all of your spokes. Count the number of spokes in your basket and cut the same number of round reed border weavers, 25-inch for the simple braid and 45-inch for the rewoven braid or longer. If you have a handle, Where it passes the rim row on each side, it counts as a basket spoke. You need to plan more space between the basket spokes if you want to use number 3 reed. Don't forget the towel in your basket to absorb water spray. If the towel gets too wet, replace it with a dry one. Soak all weavers thoroughly and spray the rim row with water to make the twine pliable. Insert your fid, packer, awl, or other tool down into the twining on the outside of your basket. Then insert one end of the weaver vertically from the bottom up under the twining which is woven over the basket spoke. Pull it up through the twining about 4 inches above the top of the rim. Next, moving to your right, skip the next basket spoke and insert your tool into the twining again. Take the other end of the weaver up through the twining. Even up both ends of the reed and pull both simultaneously until you have a scallop-looking loop on the basket about 1 inch or so from the bottom of the twining. Make your scallop whatever size you feel is right for your basket. Take the next weaver and repeat the process as before, moving over 1 spoke to the right. You should now have 4 basket spokes with 1 weaver sitting vertically on each spoke and 2 scallops below. Now let's go to the 3rd spoke from the left and insert our fid. We're going to insert a 2nd weaver alongside this one. This is also where I begin to use 2 fids to make things easier. Doing this allows me to leave the current tool in place so I don't have to reinsert each tool all the time. That 2nd tool goes in along spoke number 5. We'll insert one end of the new weaver at basket spoke number 3, just to the right of the previous weaver. The other end goes in at basket spoke number 5. Pull the ends evenly and go to the next. We next remove the fid at spoke number 3, and that leaves a pair of weavers now married to each other for the duration of the braid. This pair will be considered a single weaver. We'll build these on every spoke. Next, we slide our fid in at spoke number 4 and insert the end of our next weaver to the right of the current weaver. That done, we'll leapfrog it to spoke number 6, where we'll insert the other end of the weaver. Even things up and create the scallop. Then we go back to our fid at spoke number 5 and repeat the process. Insert weaver, leapfrog fid to number 7, insert weaver. The 2 fids really help reduce the stress on your twining and makes the whole effort easier. Work your way around the basket until all basket spokes have a pair of border weavers. Remember, as you insert the last weaver, pass it under the scallop and under the twining so it matches the position of the other scallops. Again, if your basket has a handle, it is a basket spoke and insert border weavers on it as well. You are now ready to start weaving your braided border. This is the simple double braided border we are going to weave. And this is what the basket looks like with the weavers inserted. Your scallops are even and your doubled weavers are side by side. Remember, each pair will be a single weaver because they stay together as we weave. To demonstrate this better, I've created a multicolored teaching aid to make it easier to follow the path of the weavers as they form the braid. The simple braid is a 4-step process. If you have a handle on your basket, steps 1 and 2 are done on the outside of the handle. Steps 3 and 4 are done on the inside of the handle and the basket. Step 1 is the same for both the simple braid and the rewoven braid. We'll begin by selecting a pair of weavers and tagging them. I'm using a twist tie to mark the beginning of our weaving. This tag makes it easier to locate which weaver we'll need to lift as we finish the step. This can be a little less obvious when all the weavers are the same color. Take the tagged weaver and pass it behind the weaver immediately to its right. Then bring the tagged weaver to the outside of the basket. Next, take the weaver you just wove around and pass it behind the weaver to its right and then out. Do this all the way around the basket rim. Remember, each pair is a single weaver, behind one and out, behind one and out, behind one and out. When I get to the handle, just keep going and treat it like a normal basket spoke. Behind one and out all the way around the basket. As we approach the last weaver, take the tagged weaver and raise it up a bit and remove the tag. The tag may be overkill for some. I usually don't use them, but they can be helpful reminders for new border weavers. To finish step 1, take your last weaver and run it behind the tagged weaver and through the space between it and the weaver to its right. As we finish step 1, we snug the weavers to the rim. Once the border is tight, we move on to step 2. If you're weaving along with me, this is what your basket should look like at the end of step 1. Before we begin step 2, make sure everything is nice and wet. Spray your weavers, giving them a good soaking. This will help prevent your weavers from snapping in half. As we weave step 2, we're beginning to transition to the inside of the basket. I'll point out here, as I was looking at some of the simple braids I wove in the past, I noticed the technique I used took the weavers over the second weaver and inside the basket. Some patterns use this technique. The method we are using here will be done a bit differently. I'm using the pass under the next weaver method because it mimics the pattern we'll be using for the rewoven braid in part 3. So, let's tag our first weaver and begin. First, lift the weaver just to the right of the tagged weaver. Then, we'll pass the tag weaver into that space. This gives us a pattern of up, under one, and in. Move to the right and lift up the next weaver. Take the weaver we lifted a moment ago and insert it inside the basket, following the up, under one, and in design. This almost seems too simple, doesn't it? The simple braid is very easy once you grasp the basic pattern. You should see your braid beginning to form. Up, under one, and in. If your weavers become a bit stubborn, you can pull them through one at a time to reduce the stress that might break them. Just make sure they stay parallel and don't twist. Up, under one, and in. If you have a handle, stay on the outside of the handle with step 2. The simple braid offers a lot more room to maneuver and is less binding than the rewoven braid. Remember, everything stays in pairs as you weave your border. If you inadvertently split a pair up, you'll need to back out and reweave that pair. Here you can see where I took the blue pair and wove it over the adjacent green pair instead of under it. You can see how that weave presents itself differently from the rest of the braid. This is how you will find errors in your weaving. To fix that, let's loosen the braid a little. I'll back out the blue weaver I wove incorrectly. Then I'll lift the green weaver and reinsert the blue one the right way. Look at your weaving in step 2 closely before proceeding to step 3, because it will be near impossible to fix a mistake on the outside once you've moved to the inside of the basket. As we finish step 2, we will weave the green pair under the tagged yellow weaver where we started. So let's loosen the yellow one a little using our fid to create a clear path. Then we'll insert the last weaver. The yellow weaver was a bit twisted, so we'll fix that and tighten everything down, inspecting our work as we go. If you follow the blue one, you can see the path your weaver will take from the outside to the inside of the basket, where we will weave step 3. Take away the colors, and this is what your basket would look like at this point. All the weavers are inside of the basket. Again, before beginning our next portion of the pattern, we'll soak the weavers with a generous spritz of water. If you think your towel has become too wet, carefully swap it out with a dry one. You'll want to start out with a fluffy, dry towel that can absorb a lot of moisture to prevent this problem. This spray can be your friend, keeping your weavers pliable, and your enemy if it soaks into your base. Step 3 is just like step 1, except you're weaving on the inside of the basket. So let's tag your first weaver and get started. Take your first weaver and go behind the weaver to the right and bring it out. Take the next weaver and go behind one and out. This gets a little more difficult because it's a little harder to make sure you're picking up the right weaver. Behind one and out. Behind one and out. As we get to the handle, we stay on the inside. Again, make sure you're keeping your weavers flat and parallel and not twisting them. Keep going all the way around the basket. When we get to the last weaver, we'll use our tag to open up the gap a little bit under the first weaver. Then we bring the last weaver around under the inside and out through that gap. As before, we go around the basket and tighten our weaving while we inspect what we've done for errors. Despite its intricate look, this weaving goes fairly fast. If you look at the natural colored version of the basket, you'll notice everything is pointed to the outside. Before proceeding to step 4, we'll give our weavers another soaking all the way to their ends. After that shower, I'm going to remove the towel because I'm going to be working these weavers back into the basket, and I don't want the towel to be in the way. It might also break the weavers as I try to pull it out later. Step 4 is pretty simple. It's a repeat of step 2 on the outside. Tag your first weaver. Then move to the right and lift up the next weaver. See the gap created under it when we lifted it up? We'll take our first weaver and run it down through that hole to the inside of the basket. Then move to the right, lift up the next weaver, and slide the second weaver under it into the hole just like we did in step 2. Up, under one, and in. Make sure your pairs remain parallel. See how this one is twisted? We'll pull the one in that pair that needs to be on top and put it in its place. When we get to the handle, just like in step 3, the weaving remains on the inside. As you're going along, you're creating another braid. This is why it's called a simple double braided border. You have a braid on the outside and a braid on the inside. Again, if they are a little stiff, run the reed into the hole one at a time. You don't want things to break, so be as gentle as possible. Up, under one, and in. When we make it all the way around the basket, use your twist tie to open up the gap and insert your last weaver. Then we'll tighten the weaving down one last time and let our basket dry overnight. Once dry, we'll clip these tails off and they'll slide up under the braid. To help train the weavers into that position while drying, we'll want them to dry up against the braid. I bring them up all the way to the top. By doing that, when we clip off the excess reed, the remaining ends will hide themselves up under the braid. And this is what your basket should look like as we set it aside for the night. After letting the basket dry, we're ready to trim the weavers. Watch what happens when we snip them, one pair at a time, about a 1/2 inch long. They pop right up into the rim. Be careful not to cut them too short because they will pop out of your braid. So let's work our way around the basket. Before cutting this last weaver, let's take a look at the path this weaver made around the rim. This red weaver started here on the other side of the handle. Then it traversed through here to the other side of the handle. It moved to the inside of the basket and kept going until it poked out here at the end of the path. So it traveled about 1/4 of the way around this basket. After we cut it off, we have a basket with a complete simple double braided border. And this is how your basket should look. Basket preparation for the rewoven braid is the same as the simple braid. This basket is larger than the one we used on the simple braid because of the larger presence of the rewoven braid. Still, there are several similarities between the two patterns. We start this pattern just like the simple braid, as outlined in part 1 of this video. With the weavers in place, let's get started. We created a teaching aid just like the one we used for the simple braid to make the braid paths easier to follow as we go along. I've got my towel inside my basket. This pattern will be more stressful on the weavers, so flexibility is important and we'll need to use more water. Again, there are 7 steps for the rewoven braid, but the first is just like the simple braid. So let's tag our first weaver. One thing to remember as we weave the rewoven braid, we want to keep our weavers loose. The first step is behind one and out. When you get to the handle, if you have one, stay to the outside. You might wonder, how loose is loose? Here's a couple ways I use to determine that. See this little delta right here? I stick my finger in there to measure the space. Or you can run something like basket shears into the gap to give you an idea of what I meant by loose. If you don't leave yourself enough room, by the time you get to the last steps, you may not have enough space to maneuver your reed through the braid. Use that as your template and continue around the basket, behind one and out. As we get back to our tagged weaver, raise it up a tad bit. Take that last loose weaver behind one and out, keeping your weaving even, and we won't tighten things as we did before. Remember, keep your weavers parallel. If you're weaving along with me, this is what your basket should look like right now. To begin step 2, we'll mark our first weaver and take it underneath the weaver to the right. But instead of moving to the inside of the basket, we're going to set it right on top of the neighboring weaver on the outside of the braid. If it doesn't want to stay there, use a clip to hold it. It should stay in place as you weave past it, but if not, the clip will provide temporary reinforcement. Watch your weaving to make sure the pairs are not twisting and they stay parallel to each other. Take the next weaver, the one you just passed underneath, and slide it under the weaver on its right. Perch it on top of the next weaver. As precarious as this looks, the weave will hold as we move forward. Lift, underneath, perch. Lift, underneath, perch. We're on the outside of the handle for the first 4 steps of this pattern. You can see how they stay in place as you weave past them. As we approach our tagged weaver, let's loosen it just a bit and pass underneath it, perching the weaver on top of its neighbor. That done, you can tighten the weaver back just a little bit and remove the tag. We're beginning to see our braid take shape. Now is a good time to go around the rim and make sure none of your weavers are twisted. You want them as flat as possible, but they'll naturally want to twist as you weave. Remove the colors, and this is what your basket will look like at this point. Everything is perched and the weavers are pointing up. Many basket patterns will combine steps 3 and 4. I separate them, especially for beginners. Let's show you what I mean. We'll pull some of these out of the way so you can get a clearer view. We don't need to tag the first weaver because we are simply going to take those weavers we just perched on top of their neighbors and weave them following the one they are perched on. Let's take this green one and use it to follow this red weaver as it traverses the braid. That is step 3. When we begin step 4, we'll run the weaver into this delta, but for now, we'll just follow the red weaver. Okay, to do that, we go behind these 2 weavers and in front of these other 2. Then we just let it hang out to the edge. At this point, you'll want to double check and make sure everything is still flat and parallel. Then press on all the way around the basket. If you need a little room, push the weaver you're following down just a bit and then follow the path. Now you can see the rewoven part of the braid beginning to develop around your rim. And when you get to the handle, stay to the outside. And when the last weaver sticking up goes into place, step 3 is finished. And again, check and make sure things are still flat and parallel. As I was weaving, I noticed I had a broken weaver. It doesn't happen often, but I found step 4 is a common time for them to occur. I couldn't find any advice on how to fix broken weavers, and I'm sure this is not the best fix in the world, but it is a way that I found that works. Let's use a colored reed to demonstrate the fix and make it easier to follow. I'll make the real fix with a natural reed later. First, trace the broken weaver back to its point of origin. Then slip in your replacement reed right beside this broken one and follow along the faulty weaver. You may need to loosen the weaving a bit to give it a little extra room to maneuver. You can always tighten it back down later. You'll see this broken reed follows this path right through here, and a replacement will ride right alongside as we insert it. We'll want to make sure a replacement reed has enough length to make the trip through the rest of the weaving. You don't want to run out before you get to where you're going. So I just keep tracing the route of the weaver through the nooks and crannies of the braid. You'll want this replacement soaked really well before you start because it will encounter some really tight turns along the route. I'm lifting these weavers in order for the new weaver to stay on top of the broken one. We'll need to squeeze it in between these 4, so we'll loosen the weaving to do that. As we bring it down through the passage, we arrive at the point of origin. This is where the weaver began its trek from the scallop. So, this is also where we'll hide the beginning of the replacement weaver. I'll push the new weaver inside the basket. We'll cut this excess off as we finish weaving. For now, we'll just let it hang out there. Now, before we do anything else, we want to double check our work. The broken weaver should be right underneath the replacement all the way through the braid. Just track it back and verify that it runs under the new weaver. Flatten things out if you need. You'll note when we do our next step, this pair of weavers will cover this spot. So that is where we'll cut the broken weaver. That hides the intersection. Let's bring it out a bit to make our surgery a little easier. We want to make sure we only cut the weaver we are eliminating. With a little snip, the weaver is now ready to extract. Give a gentle tug and it slips right out. Let's close the gaps, tighten things back up. Again, that intersection will be covered as these weavers come through like this. And this is what your basket looks like after step 3. We've got our natural colored replacement weaver in place, making the fix difficult to spot. We are now going to transition to the inside of the basket with step 4. So make sure the weavers are good and wet because we'll be bending the dickens out of them to make that trip. We don't want them to break, even though we know how to fix that problem. For this step, we are again following the path of another weaver. So there is no need to mark the first weaver. We're going to follow this weaver that starts right here. But instead of continuing up here, we'll detour and slide it inside the basket through this spot. You can push both weavers through at the same time. Still, I find it easier and less stressful on the weavers to send them through individually. Just make sure you keep your weavers untwisted and flat. We are heading to the handle here. This purple weaver is following this yellow one. We will divert from the yellow weaver's path at this space right before passing the handle. Make a little room. Let's run the weaver through one strand at a time. Tighten everything up when we've pulled our weaver through. And that has now transitioned to the inside. When we finish passing our last weaver into the inside of the basket, we can begin to massage the weavers to tighten them up. That tight fit we just encountered with step 4 is why we initially want our weaving loose for the rewoven braid. As you work your way around, make sure you check often that everything is flat and not twisted. This is how our demonstration basket looks as we finish the outside braid, and this is how your basket should look at this point if you're using natural colored weavers. Okay, we have 3 steps left to finish our basket. It can help if you pull the weavers out of the inside of the basket as you get started. You'll want them easy to manage. Step 5 is a lot like step 1. We'll begin by grabbing 2 weavers and tagging the first one. Then we begin the process of behind one and out. Pick up the next weaver and go behind one and out. This is the beginning of the braid on the inside of your basket. Just keep going, behind one and out, all the way around the basket. And now when you get to the handle, you stay on the inside of it. When you arrive back at the tagged weaver, raise it up a little bit to give yourself room and run that last weaver through the loop from underneath. That done, we go around the inside of the basket and tighten everything up and make sure your weavers are flat as possible against the basket rim. And this is what your basket should look like. All the weavers are poking out and ready for step 6. Again, make sure everything is good and wet. This is another one of those steps that will strain your weavers. Step 6 is basically like step 2 on the simple braid. Pick up 2 weavers, tagging the first, so we'll be clear about where we started as we finish this row. I'll pull up the weaver to my right and make some space right here. Then I'll take my tagged weaver and run it through that gap, inserting the weaver from the top. Your inside braid is becoming better defined. You can see a little bit of the lip forming around the inside of the basket. When you return to the first weaver, do as you have all the way around the basket. Pull it out, pass your last weaver through, and then remove your tag. Work your braid all the way around the basket to snug it up. Just one more step, and it's very simple. Over one and down. But some weavers may want to extend this braid with one more layer of braid in here. If you've got enough, and I have more than enough right here, you can do 2 more rows. The first, a repeat of step 5, then repeat step 6. And this is what your basket should look like after step 6 is completed. If you break a weaver on the inside of your basket, inserting a replacement weaver is a lot like the process on the outside, but a little bit easier. This is my broken weaver. As I did on the outside, I took a piece of reed, I'm using an orange one to make it easier to follow, and interlaced it right along the broken weaver. And I tucked it down here, which put it to the underside of my braid. We'll cut it off later. Now, I want to get rid of the broken weaver, so I trace it back to verify I'm cutting the right one. We'll do that about right here. That's because I want enough length to poke the end down and underneath the braid. Loosen things up a bit and snip it off. And now I'll take this end and loosen it up just a little bit and then insert the end of that weaver into the braid. Right here, putting it underneath the braid. Once I push these together, tighten things up a bit, and remove the broken end of the weaver, it will mask my repair. Here's what it looks like with the natural reed in place. We'll trim the excess of both ends when we finish step 7 and let everything dry. Step 7 is a simple over one and down finishing touch to the braid. We'll begin by placing a twist tie on the first weaver. Then we'll take that weaver and cross it over the next weaver to the right and take it down. Next, take the second weaver over its neighbor to the right and down. Over one and down. Over one and down. All the way around the basket rim. When we finish our trip around the basket, pull on the tagged weaver and open a hole. That's where we're going to insert that last weaver. Tighten all the weaving up around the basket, keeping things as flat as possible. You can now remove the towel and let this dry overnight. But before we set it aside to dry, we'll want to pull the weavers up to the rim so they'll dry in position just like we did with the simple braid. I try to get them to rise as high as I can so they can dry that way. And this is what your basket should look like as you let it dry. Once the basket has dried overnight, we're ready to finish by trimming these weavers. We'll cut them right about here, about a 1/2 inch long. Again, this is just like the simple braid. We'll do this one at a time all the way around the rim. Before I cut this last red weaver, I want to show you the path the weavers have taken through the rewoven braid. This weaver started way back here on the other side of the handle. As we follow it, it goes up and down along the outside of the rim. Then it transitions to the inside of the braid. It travels along the weaving inside the basket until it exits right here. So your weavers travel roughly 1/3 of the way around this basket. And when we clip this last weaver, our basket is done. When we remove the colors, this is what your basket should look like with its rewoven double braid. And like I did with the Gretchen rim, all the trimmings will become tension trivets. If you've never seen those made, there's a video on this YouTube channel explaining how to make them. As always, if you have any questions or if you'd like a copy of the pattern and graphics, which includes the information contained in this video, please send me an email at the address on the screen, and I'll be glad to share them with you. And feel free to send me pictures of your handiwork. I enjoy seeing the work of others. These videos are all about sharing and learning. Each video we create always enlightens us and shows us new ways to do things.